14, stayed out one night. Oh, mama.
I'm one of the folks, I'm sure you probably do it, when you see the generalists, the so-called professional smart people on TV, opining about things they don't really know about. So all these conversations about the internet and fake news and algorithms and Google. And I'm looking at the TV saying, let's talk to some real experts who actually study these things. So as you try to make sense of this moment, socially and politically, culturally, especially with the election of Trump, like from your disciplinary point of view, I'm like, how do you make sense of it? What story would you create? What narrative would you tell about how this happened?
I think that the public was sold a bill of goods about the liberatory possibilities of the internet back in the 90s. And when the full-scale datafication of our society began to develop, and, which of course we're in now, where our every move is tracked and our every kind of, in some ways, it seems like our thoughts are collected and profiled and sense making is being done about who we are, it's really undermined our civic liberties, our civil rights. I think this is a perfect moment for the public to have become numb to control and a sense of loss of control. It's a perfect moment for an autocratic, authoritarian regime to be in place. And that's what we're seeing. In fact, so many people, I'll tell you, even since the Cambridge Analytica story broke around Facebook, are kind of like, well, what can I do? I have to have it. There isn't really an easy way to withdraw from our participation in these big data projects. They're weaponized and used against the public. So this is where you have, I think, like the worship of corporations among younger generations, which I see all the time with my students, that their primary cultural identification is with companies, less with movements, right? Or values or ideas. I've been on the internet for a long time and I've slowly watched. I used to be in advertising and now I'm an academic. And I can tell you that it's just watching the loss of personal power and control and the way in which people talk about what their rights are. Rights are now about making room and space for big companies to have huge influence in their lives. I think we're going to come to a moment where the bottom is going to fall out and we're going to have to make some really tough decisions. They're projecting by 2030, 1% will own 2/3 of the world's wealth. We're talking about at the height of the labor union movement in the United States, 85% of working people were in union or were protected by unions. And now we have about 15%. So these are radical transformations that are happening in the U.S. context for sure. And of course, if you don't have organized labor, you don't have worker protections. And that means you don't have a middle class, quite frankly. You don't even have working class jobs that people can send their kids to college on anymore.
But you mentioned young people earlier and their identification with corporations and products. I don't know what you think about him. Eddie Bernays, some would say he's a great hero of the 20th century. Some would say he's a great villain, sort of the father of modern advertising. But how do you think loneliness and social alienation plays into this? That you would have folks literally saying, oh my God, I can't turn off Facebook. Or, oh my God, I can't imagine a life without these technologies. And I've talked to folks who's like, well, they didn't exist 10 years ago or 15 years ago. You've made a decision to use these technologies. And do they really enhance your life? As I joke, how many pictures of people eating bad buffalo wings at the bar do you need to see? And that's just sort of my flippant way of thinking about how things like Facebook can be used.
I think loneliness is maybe more so a byproduct of our engagement with these rather than that, loneliness or alienation are unto themselves. What we see, I think, in kind of our total consumer experience is that when you lose real social power and real economic opportunity, then you need a way to resolve that alienation that you're feeling. And so social media or technology, digital distractions become a great way, as do other kinds of industries. I teach my students, for example, about fast fashion. And talk to fashion scholars, they'll tell you that, hey, listen, when you can't afford to go to college because it's $100,000 now to get a degree, man, it feels great to get 2 sweaters for $20 at H&M. So this kind of resolution or instant gratification need is, to me, very much related to the loss of real opportunity, the loss of real wages, the fact that we have students who are working so hard to get an education or who come out of high school and for which college is not for them for whatever reasons. And what is there to feel jubilant about when you're struggling or you're 6 people living in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Bay Area or your real loss of economic clout? And this is the reality of what people are experiencing, young people in particular. And so how could you not want to feel like there is some place where the endorphins can get rolling? And of course, we know that the instant gratification kinds of experiences that people have in social media is important. You know, it triggers the psychological kind of emotional stimulations that people don't get in other parts of their life. So ultimately, I feel like the loneliness question is really more about the alienation in the lack of housing, the lack of real wages, the lack of access to affordable education. And that is incredibly lonely and it evokes real feelings of desperation, I think, for people. So they turn to other places to be gratified.
So neoliberalism and economic precarity and creating a surplus labor force. Fashion tie-in is fascinating too. Again, thinking about fashion is by definition disposable. But if that's one of the only ways in a capitalist society or elsewhere for you to find some sense of social actualization and meaning, then of course you're going to gravitate to the dopamine hit you get from fashion or from trying to be a YouTube celebrity. False types, deeply problematic in terms of what it says about power. We have all these folks gravitating to the easy entry-level version of democracy that doesn't demand any type of responsibility or real citizenship. But I can be famous and get hits and likes online or on YouTube because maybe I don't find other ways of finding social meaning. Thinking again about technology, and technological fetishism. In terms of Google, for example, and Facebook, where are we learning these lessons to worship, as we say, the ghost in the machine, the idea that these search engines are neutral somehow, or that the technology is simply revealing the truth? Because this also gets us to sort of questions about regimes of knowledge and regimes of truth.
The early internet users and evangelists, if you will, always talked about the internet as a site of liberation, that it would be this kind of nationless, borderless, raceless, classless, genderless place. And, this is in the early pre-commercial internet days, let's say, when we were in a text-based internet. Over time, of course, as the internet became wholly commercialized, for many people, the internet is Facebook. The internet is Google. They don't really kind of conceive structurally what the internet is. They are kind of relegated to Google and its products as a knowledge or sense-making tool that they rely upon. And again, you got to remember, in the context of very powerful advertising discourse about these spaces being democratic, people have come to relate to them as a form of democracy, which is hilarious and tragic, because is General Motors a site of democracy? I mean, would we frame up the products and services out of the automotive industry in that way? No, we wouldn't. We would kind of understand them for what they are. And yet people engage with the internet, which again is another corporate commercial space with lots of actors, as the site of democracy and their participation in it as democratic. And of course, we know that it is racialized, it is gendered, it is a class-based experience. All of the promises of the eradication of those limits is patently false. So I feel like, this is one of the reasons why it also becomes difficult to dislodge people's engagements with these platforms, because they've come to think of them as their participation in democracy, that they can have a voice, that they can comment on anything they want to comment on, as if it's an anything goes in a totally free space. And, we know from researchers like my colleague Sarah Roberts at UCLA, who studied commercial content moderation, that all of these platforms are in fact heavily moderating the kinds of content that comes through there. Their algorithms are sequestering and creating consumer markets of people who see certain kinds of messages or certain kinds of advertising. It's not a free-for-all. It's a highly curated space. In some ways, the companies that are engaging, the major players, are even losing control of their curatorial power because of the volume of traffic that moves through these platforms. I think it's interesting, your question about democracy vis-a-vis technology. These platforms are not a replacement for democracy on any level. If anything, they are foreclosing the possibilities of people thinking critically, because what moves through, what the primary product is in these spaces, is advertising-driven content. That's actually very different than, say, evidence-based research or other forms of knowledge that have been developed and that are critically important to democracy. Those kinds of ways of thinking and that kind of information, this as a journalist, even high quality investigative journalism, that may or may not be at the forefront of these platforms. And in my book, what I found is that the more marginalized and disenfranchised you are, probably the more likely you're going to be misrepresented and find terrible content reflecting your interests.
There's so much going on there. So you have the conflation of capitalism and democracy and freedom, and you have these really hard questions again, because this gets back to our failed and broken schools, the limited space in our public discourse, and that you want to opine, or some folks want to say, wow, there's so much emancipation and so much freedom online. But as you pointed out, well, when you have the intersections of capitalism and democracy and you don't have folks thought to think critically about what's actually going on, you're actually reinforcing power. How are those spaces reproducing social and gender and class inequality, or social inequality in general?
You hit on it, which is that these platforms actually stand in juxtaposition to public spheres of information that are increasingly shrinking. By that, I mean public schools, public libraries, public universities, public media. These are really important to creating kind of a common education and a common knowledge base in our society that we share. And they're, of course, very important sites of political struggle for representation, for fair representation, for historical accuracy, contemporary accuracy about a reporting of issues in our society. That is the sphere that's shrinking, while the sphere that's increasing is corporate controlled media. I think of these tech companies I always talk about them as media tech companies and not just tech companies, because when they're just thought of as tech companies, it's like they are not legally accountable for the content that circulates and moves through them. When they're media companies, they're actually held to different kinds of legal standards and regulatory frameworks from the FCC and so forth. So it's important that we think about tech companies as media companies because they're really now controlling the discourse. And what you see is that those who have the most capital are able to optimize their content to the top of the information pile, if you will,